Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for an event titled The Book of Creation, Magic, Nature, and Contemplation in an Ancient Jewish Mystical Text with Rabbi Dr. Jill Hammer, an accomplished scholar we're excited to host who creatively synthesizes Jewish thought and philosophy with ecological inquiry. Um, my name is Charlie Forbes. I'm the program coordinator for the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Before we begin and I introduce our speaker, I'd like to briefly take a moment and tell you about the event today and explain why we're hosting it. Um, these lecture series are designed to develop the academic field of religion and ecology by featuring the work of relevant scholars and connecting our program with a broader network of scholars, institutions, and activists. In this way, the lecture aligns with our mission to deepen the field by amplifying scholarship that enriches our understanding of ecological and religious connections, and we're appreciative to host a speaker whose work exemplifies this mission. The second point is to articulate and explore the nuances in religious worldviews. The academic field of religion and ecology owes some of its initial foundation to a famous essay from the late 1960s written by Lynn White Jr. called The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, which cited the Judeo-Christian worldview as a source of our current ecological state of affairs. But this has really resulted in a few things for our field. But one point of note is that it's critical to realize that Jewish and Christian worldviews are very different worldviews, and it can be problematic when we lump them together. So it's important to continually articulate the nuances of each as we work to navigate the ecological connections and implications, particularly for two worldviews that are continually interfacing within many disciplines and on the global stage. Lastly, this event is designed to inspire curiosity for our students and encourage a deeper inquiry into the rich tradition of Judaism and its ecological dimensions. It serves as an introduction to an exciting offering we have next semester, a course on Judaism and ecology with Dr. Ariel Mays. For those of you who are not CIS students and have found your way to us through other platforms, I want to highlight that we welcome non-matriculating students to enroll in our courses. And if you're interested, please reach out to me directly for more details. So the way we're going to run the event today is Rabbi Hammer is going to speak for about 45 minutes to an hour. The chat is open. Please feel free to share some questions as the talk goes on. Rabbi Hammer had mentioned she's if something comes up that's relevant really within the talk at the time, she can address it. Otherwise, there will be time for a Q&A at the end. And yeah, so I'm excited to introduce Rabbi Hammer. If you've hung around the Jewish world or surely the Jewish environmental world, she really needs no introduction. But Rabbi Jill Hammer, PhD, author, scholar, ritualist, poet, dream worker, and midrashist, is the director of spiritual education at the Academy for Jewish Religion and a co-founder of Beit Kohenet, a house of Jewish, mystical, earth-based feminist seeking. Her new novel is called The Moonstone Covenant, and she is the author of Undertorah, an earth-based Kabbalah of dreaming, Return to the Place, the magic, meditation, and mystery of Sefer Yetzirah, the Hebrew Priestess, ancient and new visions of Jewish women's spiritual leadership, the Jewish Book of Days, a companion for all seasons, the Omer calendar of biblical women, Sisters at Sinai, New Tales of Biblical Women, and the Book of Earth and Other Mysteries. She is also the author of academic articles, essays, and poems. She is the translator of the Romanu Siddur and of Siddur HaKohanot, a Hebrew priestess prayer book. She lives in Manhattan with her family. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rabbi Hammer, and I will pass the floor over to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much to Charlie Forbes and the whole program for having me. And I'm really honored to get to address all of you about a topic that I really love and an ancient book that I find so relevant to contemporary life. I'm getting over a cold, so forgive me. My voice is a little bit hoarse, but I hope you can hear me okay, and I'm very excited to speak with you all. So I'm going to say a few words of introduction to the book that I'm going to speak about, which I find to be a really amazing ancient resource for a contemporary eco theology and spiritual wisdom. And then I'll show a few passages from the book, and I hope to demonstrate some of the things that I think are important about this text. So the text is called, as you know from the beginning of my presentation, or perhaps you know from other sources, the Book of Creation. In Hebrew, Sefer Yetzirah, Yetzirah meaning creation, formation, or making, as in a kind of artistry. And this is a very unusual Jewish book. There is a lot of disagreement about when and where it was written. Some people think it was written as early as, before the first millennium. Others think it was written as late as the 9th century. Some scholars tend to put it at the 6th century in Mesopotamia, and that's where I'm going to put it. But in some ways, it doesn't matter so much where it comes to us from, um, but more the ideas that it expresses and the language that it uses. It is really brief for a Jewish book of this period. It is written in a kind of cryptic poetry, and it tells the story of creation. There's a book that tells its own story about how the world is made using the Hebrew letters, each of which channels an elemental force. And so as the book proceeds to talk about the various elemental forces and the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, uh, it creates a kind of holistic view of creation as mediated through these elemental forces, beginning with the singularity of God, and ending with a vast diversity of creations. And in some ways, the book's fundamental question and premise is, how does diversity exist? Right? How is it that an original oneness can lead to the vast diversity of life and being on Earth that we see? And so the book attempts to tell this story, looking at the physical attributes of the world, time, space, and what it calls soul, which really means being, as proceeding from divine essence, and as each being an integral part of a complex creation. It's an unusual book in that it's not a book of law. It's not a book of story, even really. It's not a book of philosophy. If anything, I would say that it is a kind of amalgam of magic and meditation. It offers clear, um, quite extraordinary images uh, as it attempts to communicate very complex views of how creation comes into being. And the reason that I think it is such an essential tool in thinking about ecotheology today is that it is a mystical book in that it is interested in the workings of the divine being, right? And how humans can have access to that, to those mysteries. But it is a mysticism of the here and now. Unlike other mystical Jewish books of this time period, which often imagine visiting heaven, right? Sort of imagining visiting divine realms, Sefer Yetzirah really attempts to probe the mystery of the physical world as it exists. And to me, this is a really extraordinary ecological resource because it is a mysticism of the present, and of a being as we actually experience it in our physical bodies. So as we look through the passages, I hope that I'll be able to show how in some ways Sefer Yetzirah is interested in meditative practice, that is in offering tools for the individual seeker to be present to the world as it is, right? And to be present to an experience of the divine. And yet it's also a book of magical practice, and that is interested in how can we as created beings have access to creativity? How do we create worlds? And this, I think, is also a really important question for us as contemporary people. In a world where humans have such vast power over the over our world and over the environment, to think about. Right, Sefer Yetzirah asks us to reflect on how we are using our creativity. I'll just say a couple of other things, and then I hope to show some passages from the book. Um, I will say something about Sefer Yetzirah's sense of the physical space of the cosmos as a sacred space. Right? This is a time period where Jewish communities are struggling in different ways with the question of exile. Right? What does it mean to not be living in the ancestral land? What does it mean to be dealing with various historical cataclysms? And the way that Sefer Yetzirah seems to address this question, right, is by constructing a temple that is a cosmic temple, right, so that it transcends the physical building of the temple, right, by speaking about the entire cosmos as a temple, particularly speaking about the six directions of space, right, as a kind of building, as a kind of structure that God puts in place in order to preserve the physical creation. So this infusion of the idea of physical space with sanctity is both unusual at this time and really powerful, and is picked up by later Kabbalistic traditions and elaborated on in centuries after this book. There is a deep connection in Sefer Yetzirah between speaking and being. The idea of letters as elemental forces is connected to the notion of word and world being connected, that one speaks and things come into being, right? This is part of the book's magical approach in a certain way. I'll mention that there is a metaphor around engraving, right? This really comes from engraving the tablets of the Ten Commandments. But the idea of engraving is relates to creating channels between the divine realm and the physical world, and that these channels, through which some kind of mysterious intention or energy moves, uh, constitute a network of connection between oneness and manyness. That I think is quite resonant with some contemporary forms of ecological mysticism. I'll say one last thing about the book, which is that uh, the book often, in speaking of these cosmic forces that are partners with the creator in making creation, are often feminized. This begins a long Kabbalistic tradition of introducing feminine forces into the creative process, and is a book that I find to be relatively free of misogyny in a time period where that's very unusual. So I wonder very much about who created this book. It's probably a compilation of several authors that was edited together. Um, and it's really not widely studied although Aryeh Kaplan produced a translation years ago that became quite popular, so that people began to read it again in the English-speaking Jewish world. But I think it's a really amazing theological resource, and I'm excited to get to present it to you and see what you think of it. So the book really speaks through images. So in some ways, I think it will become more clear as we delve into its images directly. So let me start with that process. Sefer Yetzirah has a very tight literary structure. It is not a sprawling work like the Talmud, right? It begins with an introductory paragraph. Each chapter deals with a particular important topic, a particular category of elemental forces. Then there's a conclusion, and then the book is done. It has a kind of ritualistic, careful unfolding. And its opening paragraph looks like this. And really, each paragraph needs some unpacking. So, we'll sit with the words, and I'll also do some unpacking because in this book, every word is packed and a tremendous amount of meaning and imagistic resonance. So the book begins, and I won't read all the Hebrew, but I'll just read this paragraph just so that people have a sense of what it sounds like. Shloshim ushtayim netivot peliot chochma hakak ya yud he vav he tzevaot b'shalosh sefarim b'sefer usefar b'sipur. Wisdom's 32 marvelous paths, Yah engraved the becoming one who holds many. Within 3 books, tome, tally, and tale, or in a less literary vein, book, number, and story. This is my translation that I published and returned to the place. The book opens by speaking of wisdom's 32 marvelous paths. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom is a mysterious feminine entity who is witness to God's creation and who mediates the knowledge of that creation to human beings. Sefer Yetzirah takes this concept of wisdom and looks at wisdom as a kind of network that creates channels, that creates sort of open pathways between God and the world. So if you think almost like a mycelial network, that's how I think of wisdom in Sefer Yetzirah. And these 32 pathways are the 10 Sefirot. And I'm going to talk about Sefirot in a moment. It's a Hebrew word that means divine attributes. These Sefirot are a little bit different than the ones in the later Kabbalah, for those of you who may be familiar with that concept. So there are 10 Sefirot, which really refer to divine parameters or attributes that define the cosmos. And there are 22 Hebrew letters, and that makes up the 32. The Hebrew number 32 also makes up the word lev, which means heart. So these pathways are also the heart, and that's also the book's meditative purpose, right, is to implant these pathways within the heart. So it has, at the same time, it has a very cosmic scope. It also has very much a focus on the human consciousness and how the human consciousness can be molded to encompass this larger reality. Right? How do we as humans open to the larger reality? I really see that as the fundamental question of Sefer Yetzirah. These 32 paths are engraved, hakakya, God engraved them, right? So that it's almost like God is engraving in reality as if it's stone, right? And running these pathways back and forth between the creator and the creation. And these pathways come in 3 books. And the use of the term books is not an accident because it relates, of course, to the books of the Torah, right? But it is also books of reality. If you were to think of contemporary physics, right, talking about dimensions, and the dimensions are books, like think about it like that, because these books are space, time, and being. Sefer, book, tome here, number, tally, Sefer, and pale, story, sipur, are, right, a book has takes up physical space, that's space. Numbers count forward into the future, that's time. And the story, right, you have to have a being, you have to have an entity in order to tell a story, right? So that's soul. And these 3 dimensions are going to recur in Sefer Yetzirah. And there's almost like a kind of I really feel like there's a kind of intuition about physics, right? You could almost imagine Niels Bohr talking about this, right? That there is space, there's time, and then there's perspective, right? Which is something that quantum physicists have been talking about. So there's something quite wonderful and quite scientific in a sense about this. So let me share a few more of the passages, giving a sense of sort of where the ecological resonance is in this book. I'll just look at one more introductory paragraph here. Sefer Yetzirah is always careful to tell what it's about to do. So it elaborates the 5 categories of being that it understands to be part of the physical reality of the world. It talks about these sfirot blima, these ethereal dimensions, or we could translate sphera as an inscription and translate it inscriptions of the void, which I really love because, in a sense, the book is imagining how the original primordial creation becomes divided into many entities, right? So if you imagine the laws of physics being inscribed on the world, it's something like that. Then there are 22 foundation letters, which can also mean element letters. And these come in three categories. Mothers or matrices, there are three of those: air, water, and fire. Interestingly, earth is not an element in Sefer Yetzirah. It's a subcategory of water. So all the elements flow. It's a three-element system: air, water, and fire. And then there are two other categories: seven doubles, seven letters that represent all the dualities in the world. We probably won't talk about them much, but they're interesting. And 12 simple letters. And each of these letters has a manifestation in physical space as an entity or as a substance, like air, has a manifestation in time as a season or a day or a month, and has a manifestation in the body. So each element that makes up the world also makes up the human body. So this is the beginning of a macrocosm, microcosm way of thinking about the world that is going to extend for the rest of Jewish mysticism. And that I think is quite ecologically relevant, because the idea that we are in fact made up of the elements that make up the world and are not separate from, right, the wider substance of the world, it feels like an ecological insight. So in the title of my talk, I talked a little bit about the way that this book addresses both a magical practice and a meditation practice. And this particular passage, which in some ways for me is the heart of the book, has a meditative quality. And I think it also has an ecological quality. And so I want to say something about that. And this chapter, this is from chapter 1, and all the passages in chapter 1 always begin with the tagline 10 inscriptions of the void, to let us know that that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the fundamental parameters of the cosmos. And in order for us to understand these fundamental parameters, the book gives us meditative advice. Right? That in order to really grasp the wonder of creation, the human brain has to do certain things. Right? And one of the things that it has to do, right, is stop its internal monologue and allow itself to become aware of what is larger than itself. And so the book actually gives insight into how to do this. And in this paragraph, it says, stop your mouth from speaking. Stop your heart from murmuring. And if your heart runs, return to the place. For scripture says, running and returning. Regarding this matter, a covenant was made. You could imagine a paragraph like this in a basic mindfulness class. Right? The book begins by saying, right, when you are internally dialoguing, right, when you are speaking and murmuring, and heart here means consciousness. In this time period, the consciousness is regarded as residing in the heart. So it doesn't just mean feelings, it means consciousness. So when your consciousness is muttering to itself, right, you cannot actually become aware of these larger dynamics in the world. And so the first thing is to still your internal monologue. Right? But because we are human and we can't always still that larger monologue, the book offers us a practice of what it calls running and returning. Right? If your heart runs, return to the place. Right? So in other words, when you become distracted, right, return to the focus. And what's wonderful about the word place here, as perhaps some of you may know, is that the Hebrew word for place can mean a lot of different things. It can mean the physical place that one is, but it's also a term that's used for the divine. It's also a term that is used for God. Hamakom, the place, is one of the names for God. So it also means return to your consciousness of divinity. And Hamakom can also mean the temple. The place can also mean the sacred place. So in very few words, the book is actually inviting us into a practice of continuing to return and focus, right, to what is most sacred. And the book uses the phrase running and returning, which is drawn from the book of Ezekiel, in which the divine presence is running and returning among the creatures that are bearing the divine chariot. And seems to be using this phrase running and returning to refer to the kind of currents of electricity or the intention that runs between the creator and the created. And it also refers to the mind being pulled back, or being pulled back to this sacred focus. And the passage concludes by saying that there's a covenant regarding this, which is a very powerful Hebrew word, brit, covenant. And in Sefer Yetzirah, it seems to refer not so much to a sort of national agreement type of covenant, but to a covenant between the individual seeker and the creator, right? That there is a returning to the relationship, right? That is covenantal. That is part of a larger connection between us and the one. If you wanted to translate this into ecological terms, right, you would say that there is a fundamental relationship between us, right, and the natural world, right, to which we have the potential to always return. This passage is guiding us toward a five-dimensional cosmic temple view of creation. I'll share one more of these introductory passages before we get to the actual description of the created world. This one also begins 10 inscriptions of the void, and it describes a reality in which the physical world is completely intertwined with the spiritual world and they cannot be separated. 10 inscriptions of the void, their end is embedded in their beginning and their beginning in their end, like a flame in a fiery coal. For the Creator is one and has no second, and before one, what are you counting? I'm going to read it again. 10 inscriptions of the void, their end is embedded in their beginning and their beginning in their end, like a flame in a fiery coal. For the Creator is one and has no second, and before one, what are you counting? These 10 attributes, these 10 parameters that are inscribed on the physical universe are embedded in their creator, and the creator is embedded in them. In other words, this is a kind of panentheistic or maybe even pantheistic view of creation. Right? The physical terms of life on Earth and of existence in the cosmos cannot be separated from their origin in the creator. That is the view of Sefer Yetzirah as I am reading the book. And the image that the book gives in order to explain this concept is the image of a flame and a coal, because you cannot separate neatly a flame from the coal that it arises out of. And if you think about a coal with a flame coming out of it, right, you cannot take away the coal and leave the flame, or vice versa, right? They are completely inseparable. So that the creator infuses, if you want to think of the creator as the flame, right, infuses the coal. Or you could say the creator is the coal, right? The flame is the existence, right? And one arises from the other and they're inseparable. And this passage goes on to further explain its non-dual view of the world by saying the creator is one right, and has no second. This is actually not controversial in a Jewish context at this time, right? This is what you would expect the Jewish text to say. But for Sefer Yetzirah, that the creator is one doesn't just mean that there isn't a second creator. Rather, it means that there is nothing other than the right? Before one, what are you counting, right? When you are sitting before the one or before the number one, think about the number zero, right? Before the number one, there's no need for counting, right? In other words, there's nothing to count. There are no distinctions. There's no one thing and another thing. There is no duality. There's just unity. It's almost a kind of Zen koan like statements. Before one, what are you counting? And how do we get out of our dualistic mind that says, here's one thing and here's another, here's me and here's God, here's me and here's the world, right? How do we get out of that sense of separation, right? This text is almost sort of playing with that sense of separation and saying, stop counting, right? Counting is not what's required here, right? What's required is something deeper than separation. And this is another text that's meant to invite us into this non-dual worldview. And now perhaps we're ready to actually see how Sefer Yetzirah describes the created world, which I hope will feel relevant for you as people interested in views of sacred ecology. So I'll just show you this cube. We'll come back to the cube. Let's look at the words first, and then I'll explain the hypercube. So the book says to us, 10 inscriptions of the void. Their measure is 10, yet they are infinite. A depth of beginning and a depth of end. A depth of good and a depth of evil. A depth of above and a depth of below. A depth of east and a depth of west. A depth of north and a depth of south. And a singular master, a faithful divine ruler, rules over them all from God's holy dwelling and out to eternity. If one looks carefully here, you can see the 3 dimensions that I mentioned closer to the beginning of the lecture. These are the 10 Sefirot, there are 10 of them, but they also fall neatly into the 3 categories of space, time, and being. A depth of beginning and a depth of end, right? That's time, right? These 2 Sefirot of beginning and end form a kind of infinite line that inscribes time into the universe. Above, below, east, west, north, and south are space, right? These 3 dimensions comprise the world of physical space. And the terms good and evil here you might recognize from the Garden of Eden, right? We could also translate them good and bad. And we can understand them as ethical good and bad, or we could also understand them as experiential good and bad. That is, pleasure and suffering. And that's the dimension of being, of perspective, right, of soul. And so these 10 parameters comprise the universe, and the creator, in this understanding, rules over them all from God's holy dwelling, Mima'on Kodsho, and out to eternity. To me, this suggests that the divine is at the center of this structure and not outside it. Or if you want, you could also imagine a divinity existing at every point. Right? This is not kind of a Maimonidean view of the cosmos, in which the cosmos is a kind of snow globe, right? And God is outside the snow globe. Right? That's not what it looks like. Right? This is a structure in which the center of the snow globe, right? That is where the divine lives, right? There is there is an indwelling, right? To use the Jewish term Shekhinah, there is an indwelling, there is a presence, right, within the physical universe in all of its different dimensions. So this was an attempt to create what this looks like. It's actually it's what you would call a hypercube. It's a 5-dimensional space. Right? It's got 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time, and one dimension of experience. And that's what the world looks like. So although the book is not speaking specifically about trees, animals, and so forth, you can actually see the way that it is reinscribing the human relationship with creation as a whole. I think we have time. I want to take you on a little bit of an elemental journey. There's a second telling of creation, which is a little bit different than this one, so it's a little confusing actually, but it's quite beautiful. There's a second telling of creation that I want us to look at. And the reason I want to look at it is because it's an elemental progression from one thing to many things. And maybe from a different author, but just in sync with the book's perspective. And in this progression of creation, we hear 10 inscriptions of the void, 1 breath of the living God. She is the Holy Spirit. I haven't been using gender up until this point, but I'm going to use it just for the next 4 paragraphs because it's a little bit useful to see how the book is structuring its internal dynamics. The first sphira here is literally God's breath. So it's as if God, instead of speaking the universe, as in Genesis 1, actually breathes the universe, right? Which is really a wild image, right? It's a very different sort of image. And this breath is also an entity, a living spirit, right? She is the Holy Spirit, in Jewish sources means the prophetic inspiration that can come on human beings. So this breath it's actually like later Kabbalah, the Shekhinah. It's a manifestation of divinity outside the core of divinity. It's like an extension of divinity into the world. The second sphira, breath from breath, 2, breath from breath. He engraved and carved within her the 4 winds of heaven. So the Creator takes this holy breath, right, this emanation, right, and stretches her out, and then the one, right, the 1 becomes 2, the 2 become 4, right, and now we have the 4 winds of heaven. So now we've got a physical space. Breath becomes air, air becomes water, 3, water from wind. He engraved and carved in them chaos and void, mud and clay, engraved them like a kind of garden, carved them like a kind of wall, wove them like a kind of ceiling. So here we have the Creator making the primordial void, chaos, engraving and carving in that chaos mud and clay, so it begins to become earth. It is a garden, it has a wall, and it has a ceiling. Right? So this is really a 3-dimensional earth space. It's like a terrarium. Right? And it's inside this terrarium, right, that life then becomes possible. Right? If you think about, right, the atmosphere of the earth, right, this has something in common with that image. Next, fire from water. 4, fire from water. He engraved and carved in her, right, that is the water. the throne of glory, and all the heavenly hosts. Right? So the water is carved into fire. The fire becomes the throne of glory, the angels, and the stars. And then a proof text from the Bible is offered regarding he makes the winds his messengers, flaming fire his ministers. So it's offering us a kind of proof from a biblical text. The reason I brought the pronouns in here is because there's a really strong dynamic between the masculine and the feminine, right? In which the feminine elements become a partner with the creator in order to create the world. But you could translate this gender neutrally also, and it would be you would not lose a lot of the meaning. So these four elements create a kind of house with two stories. One house is the earth with the earthly beings in it. The other house is the heavenly house with the stars and the angels in it. They are both part of this created world that is surrounded, right, by the concept of space, time, and being. And now all that's needed is to seal this house in place, right, in order for creation to begin to multiply inside it. And this is what that looks like. The book goes on to basically adopt a Jewish magical practice called sealing. Sealing really means three things. It means to complete something. It means to stamp one's identity into something, right? And what we can see here is that God is sealing the world using the letters of God's name, which is a kind of stamping of God's identity into the world. And sealing also means to protect something from outside influence. And it's very common in Jewish magical practice at this time period to create incantation bowls, pottery bowls that are magical spells. They're inscribed with spells. And they are used to keep things like demons, illness, and misfortune out of your house. And you bury them under the threshold or in the corners of the house. And there are lots of them. You can see them in the British Museum or in Iraq. There are many of them. And this is really God doing a magical practice of sealing the cosmos with the 6 combinations of the letters of God's name, the Hebrew letters Yud, He, and Vav. So God faces above, below, east, west, north, and south, and seals each direction. So if you think about the question of whether the universe is finite or infinite, right? Does the universe expand infinitely, right? Or does it have a boundary? For Sefer Yetzirah, the infinite universe has to be contained within a boundary in order for the cosmos to be safe, basically, in order for the world to have a place that is nurturing of life. As I hope I've shown, this is not a view in which the most important things happening in the cosmos are happening in hidden realms. This is not, for example, like the Book of Enoch, right, where the character travels to the hidden realms and explores what the divine realm looks like. Right? This is a mysticism of the physical world, right, in which every point in the physical world has a place, has a time, right, and has an entity, right, associated with it, right, that seals it, right, that identifies it as unique, right, in the world, in the cosmos. And each of those points has an access to the creator, right, through these channels, these engravings that go back and forth between the creator and the divine. So I want to show you 2 more things, and then perhaps I'll stop and we can talk about this a little bit. This is a segment from chapter 2, which discusses the Hebrew letters. And it's very beautiful. And it says, the divine forms substance out of void. It's tohu mamash. Tohu is like the biblical without form and void. God made out of the void mamash. Mamash is a word that means something. It means like a literal substance, like a physical thing. Mamash. The divine formed substance out of void and worked it in fire, and it became. So this is like the creator as glassblower or smith, using letters to form creation, but in this very physical way, and worked it in fire, and it became, and formed great pillars out of air that cannot be grasped. Now, what's amazing about this phrase, right, is it evokes the temple, because the temple has pillars, right? The amudim, like the pillars of the temple, are an entity. So it is invoking the pillars. It's also invoking the book of Proverbs, which talks about the pillars of wisdom's house. But these pillars are also the throat, right? And words, right, are pillars that we make out of air that cannot be grasped, right? And Sefer Yetzirah is very much about the magic of speech, and how speech can bring things into being, right? So these pillars, right, are also words, right, that we are able to form out of air, and that we can't grasp them, but they have tremendous power to create. And I also think of these pillars that are formed out of air as atoms, right? Although Sefer Yetzirah might not have had conscious access to that information, right? This is actually a great insight that most of us is empty space, right? Most of form is empty space. And there are several places in Sefer Yetzirah that allude to this, that allude to the emptiness that is at the underpinning of creation. And later Kabbalah will also talk about this. We'll also talk about the empty space at the heart of creation. So there's something here about the mystery of the physical world as it is that I really find so, so powerful. And I'll just conclude our sharing of texts with a piece from chapter 3. Chapter 3 describes the Hebrew letters Aleph, Mem, and Shin. The letter Aleph connected to air, the letter Mem connected to water, and the letter Shin connected to fire. And each of these three entities forms an important structure in the world. The Aleph is the air that we breathe. The Aleph is also the temperate season. The Aleph is also the chest where the heart and the lungs reside. The Mem is the water, that's the below. The Mem goes with the underworld, sort of the waters under the earth. The Mem goes with the cold season, with the rainy season, and it also goes with the belly. So if you think about the belly, right, under the chest, right, the Mem goes under the Aleph. And Aish, fire, right, the Aleph goes with the head. The Shin goes with the head. The Shin also goes with the sky, with the heavens, and with the summer. And these three letters together make up the world we live in, but they also make up the human body. And so if I would do a meditative practice with you, a practice I often take my students through, right? We would breathe into the chest, to the belly, and to the head, right? And we would use that, right, as a way of becoming focused and also a way of connecting to these larger cosmic forces. And through those forces, right, to the creator and the creation as a whole. And this beautiful drawing of the Aleph, Mem, and Shin together in a single sphere is by Tammuz Shiran. You can see the Shin on the top there, the three prongs, the Aleph to the right, and the Mem in the watery cave there to the left. So there's so much more to say about this amazing book, but I often teach it as an ecological resource for my rabbinical students, for students in other Jewish contexts, and in larger contexts, as a book that we can mine for a view of creation that is not dualist, right? That doesn't understand the best part of creation as a part that we don't have access to. So that, the thing that humans are meant to do is escape to somewhere else, right? This is a theology, right, that draws us deeper into the physical world, and deeper into the complexity and the diversity of that physical world. And so for me, it is an extraordinary resource, uh, for mining an ancient source that connects us to our ancestors, that connects us to how people thought in generations before us, but that also has a lot of resonance with how we might choose to think today, right, about the sacredness of the cosmos, and the beauty of the diversity of our planet. Uh, and so I hope that you'll also find that some of this is useful, and powerful, in resonance with your own thinking about this. So I think that I will stop here, for some conversation and maybe some questions. You may have questions about the book. You may have questions about one of these texts, or perhaps you have thoughts about the echo theological ramifications of all this. So I'm open to questions and conversation. And if you want me to put anything back on screen so that you can remember what it says, please just let me know.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Hammer. Wow, it's a lot to digest. I'm feeling your comment at the end about there's a lot more to say. Um, so if I may, if I can take the liberty of maybe starting us off with a question, um, I'd love the chance to do so. Everyone, please feel free to either drop a question in the chat or raise your hand. We can call on you. Um, so whatever you're thinking and reflecting on. So I guess actually I have two questions, if that's okay. The first is at the beginning you did situate us um, briefly with where this text or how this text kind of falls within the general canon of literature, Jewish literature. But I would be curious to know how you feel uh, it is being integrated and accepted largely throughout the uh, Jewish and non-Jewish worlds. That would kind of be one question. And I'm also really curious about this point you made about sealing. Um, and I've been thinking of this sort of elemental consciousness and progression you walked us through. And I'm doing something in my own brain with thinking about it in a linear way, which is not sitting well with me. And maybe you can speak to that. But I was asking myself, where else do I find it? I was thinking about the bedtime Shema and sort of the B'Shem Hashem prayer and putting the angels around you. So this practice of the hypercube. And and that was the only thing I could think of where it's like in ritualized. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about how this practice of sealing and the sort of the elemental consciousness um, is used and how we can work with it. So I know those were two questions, so please forgive me. Um,
No, that they're both great. So let me address the first, and then if I need to be reminded of the second, please do. So actually, let me talk about the second first. So some of you may be familiar with the practice of waving a lulav and the harvest festival of Sukkot. It's a palm branch accompanied by willow and myrtle, and beautiful yellow fruit. And this is a ritual tool that's used on the harvest festival. And you shake it in the six directions. So the lulav is actually, you can pair it with this practice, right? You can pair it with this elemental practice of sealing the directions, of inviting blessing into the different directions. And in fact, the temple offerings were all waved in the directions. Like if you look in the Mishnah, you can see that originally that the lulav is the only remnant we have of it in our contemporary Jewish life. But originally, all offerings were waved in the directions. So this is akin to lots of traditions that use the language of the four or the six directions as a language for the diversity of creation, the totality of creation. right? And so that's another place where it's still used. And I think the angel blessing, was also a really wonderful example. Um, I use concepts and images like this in my own ritual work when we're creating a sacred circle at the beginning of a prayer session or the beginning of an experience. I think it is usable. There's good material here to create new old ritual space. And it's definitely authentic to the original culture. If you look, for example, at how the Torah describes the tabernacle, right? It has a menorah, fire in the south, right? It has bread, earth in the north. It has a water basin, right? Water in the west, and then it has the incense altar, which you could argue is air in the east. So you could actually see it there too, if you like. Ecclesiastes mentions the elements in the very first verses of the book of Ecclesiastes, moving in cycles. So there's lots there to work with. Should people want to work with it in this particular tradition. Um, Let me say a little bit about the first question and situating the book. So as I said, we don't really know where the book came from. My guess would be it comes from some mystical community in North Mesopotamia, right? Some Jewish community in North Mesopotamia that was familiar with magic, and was not so interested in the Talmud, was interested in other kinds of Jewish expression, and was interested in mysticism. The book was really adopted into Jewish culture, right, by Jewish commentators and philosophers who were really interested in it. So Saadia Gaon, for example, is a Jewish philosopher who begins to write about Sefer Yetzirah as a book of philosophy, which I personally don't think that's what it is, but that's what he wrote about it as. And from um, those commentaries really evolve into what is later called Kabbalah, right? And Kabbalah brings forward many of the concepts that are in Sefer Yetzirah, alters them, elaborates on them, right, and creates whole books, right, of Jewish mysticism, right, later on, right, in the 12th and 13th century and onward. And from there, right, Sefer Yetzirah's ideas kind of go all over the Jewish world. And it's still a book that is studied today, not only in an academic context, but in Jewish traditional contexts. And it's not widely read, not because it's not an accepted book, but because it's an obscure book. It's not widely read because other books are read much more. But I think it should be widely read. So that's my mission. I hope that helps a little.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Sarah, I see your hand up.
Mhm.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Rabbi Hammer. I what this recalled for me, and I know we're talking about ancient Hebrew texts, but I was reminded of this quote that sort of has been haunting me, and I went to go find it. It's from a book called From Where We Stand, by Deborah Tall, and she said, Yiddish is said to be the only folk language in the world that has no base in nature. Its vocabulary is bereft of plants and animals, almost the entire natural world. And I wonder, like, is that true? And how does that relate in your mind to this legacy of eco-spiritual Jewish text? I mean, I guess it makes sense from the perspective of Yiddish speaking Jews in that period not having potentially the time to bond with a place. And yeah, your discussion of the place was really fascinating to me from that perspective, like to be part of a people that don't have a home in that way that could be grounded in, in the natural world. If you have anything to say on that, I'd be curious.
Sure, I'm happy to. So first of all, I want to encourage you to read the book Ashkenazi Herbalism. I don't think I agree that Yiddish doesn't have any word for plants. I that doesn't seem right to me. There were Yiddish, or I'm not a Yiddish scholar, but there were Yiddish herbalists, there were, there were healers, there were certainly people keeping animals. That feels like an extreme statement to me. I don't think I would buy that. But beyond that, what I'll say is, there is a sort of eternal Jewish question around the question of place. Like, are we connected there? Are we connected here? Where do we belong? That different Jewish communities deal with differently, right? And the community, whatever it may have been, out of which Sefer Yetzirah arose, is clearly grappling with that same question. Like, where is the temple in the absence of the temple? Where do we belong? And this particular book seems to offer the idea that the entire cosmos is a temple and you can be at home anywhere, right? There's no place that is devoid of the presence. There's no place that doesn't have a connection to the sacred. And I think that's a rather extraordinary answer to the question. It's not the only answer, right? There are other Jews at this time, right, who are figuring out how to get back to the ancestral land, or who are forming synagogues, or who are, right, there are lots of different ways, or, right, who are traveling even farther away, right? There are lots of different ways that Jews are coping with the question of exile, right, in this time period and then beyond. But this particular approach, right, to the trauma, right, of exile really seems to have to do with a mystical sense of the presence of divinity everywhere at every point in the cosmos. And in that sense, it's a very universalist book, right? It's not a book that talks a lot about specific Jewish forms, somewhat. Right? It talks about the alphabet, right, which of course is a Jewish form. But there is a universalist tone to the book that I think is really interesting. So, and I think later Jewish mysticism, right, which grows up in France and Spain, right after the Inquisition, right, at a time when, this is also a really difficult question, right, is saying something similar, right, talking about the ways that they discovered divine presence in the moon, right, in apple orchards, right, in the physical world as they understood it through their own spiritual lens. So this continues to be an answer to that question, right? The mystical answer, right? Which is that, right, God can be found anywhere, right? The sacred place can be found anywhere. So while the question is still a burning question, I think this is one really powerful way that the Jews have chosen to deal with. How do we continue to connect to the sacred when the sacred has become so diffuse, right, for us in terms of place? And I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you so much.
Oh, let me say one more thing about this, which is my dear friend and colleague Annie Cohen writes about the practices of Jewish women regarding cemeteries in Europe and the way that they would relate to the ancestral, to the dead through various rituals. And I think that was also a kind of emplacement. You go to where ancestors are. That's one place that people do that. So there's lots of ways of connecting to sacred place.
I just want to make sure I pause here if there's space, if anyone. Alexis, thank you.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Rabbi Hammer. I have a question. I'm curious. I know you showed some images with your presentation, and I'm wondering if there are any visual artists who have elaborated on these ideas that you could recommend further, or any imagery that depicts this with greater detail.
Yeah, wonderful. There's a I'm looking for my folder of images because I want to actually share something with you. A lot of Kabbalists actually drew images trying to explain all of this in their manuscripts. So there's actually some really terrific stuff there. And I'm looking for one particular thing that I want to show you. Here it is. So one of the images in Sefer Yetzirah is a double wheel, or anyway, a wheel of letters that's used to create many combinations of the sacred letters. So this is it. And this is I actually was trying to explain to my students how this wheel worked, and I began drawing it on the board. Like Arya Kaplan's a very complex view of this, and I was like, no, this is much simpler. Wait, it's a double wheel, and I drew it, and then I found it in a manuscript by Cordovero, who's an important Kabbalist. So I was really jazzed about that. But this is one of those images from manuscripts. But in terms of contemporary artists, David Friedman, who lives in Sfat, is known for his art around Sefer Yetzirah, creating art using the letters and their relationships to each other. So that's one artist that you could look up. Whenever I teach this class in my rabbinical, in the program, in the seminary where I teach, I always assign an art project at the end of the class. So people always are creating different sorts of art around Sefer Yetzirah. And people have made their own hypercubes, and they've made pottery and all kinds of paintings, all kinds of beautiful things. But Friedman is the name that I know if you want to look for more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And did you say, just to real quickly, Annie Cohen wrote on cemeteries? Is that who you said?
She wrote on Jewish women's cemetery ritual. Yeah, she writes terrific stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
I do see one more follow-up from Sarah, just asking about the text you mentioned about the divinity of the apple orchard.
Oh, yeah. So the Zohar, which was written in 13th century Spain, is one of, I would probably say, the most important Kabbalistic document. It purports to be a Torah commentary. It isn't really. It's really a description of multiple spiritual journeys that mystics are taking together. And it invokes all kinds of powerful images of the divine, including the apple orchard. The divine feminine is depicted as an apple orchard. And so if you're going to read it, I recommend Daniel Matt's translation. It's not that easy to read without a teacher because it's a very, very intensely symbolized text. You really have to decode it. But Daniel Matt has a wonderful translation of the Zohar. I'll put the name in the chat. Sure thing. Don't be shy, everybody.
I would love it if you could maybe speak a little bit more about the heart. I don't know maybe how to come at that question. I think there's a few different vantage points, given what you mentioned during the talk, but would you just be able to maybe elaborate or just talk about the heart and how it fits into this text?
Absolutely. I'm searching right now for another passage that I'd love to show you, but my computer has to cooperate. The heart, in some ways is a core question of the book, as it hints in that opening passage. And because I see this really as partly a meditative text, it's really dealing with questions not just of what reality is like, but how we respond to reality, right? How we are in dialogue always with with this larger truth. And in that sense, I really think the book is a meditative book. It intends to give the reader practices and not just ideas. Like the book intends, it's a ritual, it's a book of ritual in a sense. It intends to offer practices, and not only to offer like a philosophy. And so each section, I think, is actually a practice. So here's a passage much later in the book that maybe will help illustrate this. So this is from chapter 6. And it describes these three entities, the dragon, the wheel, and the heart. And each of these entities is a guiding force in one of the three dimensions of the cosmos. So the dragon in the world, right, is this is actually is an astrological phenomenon. It's like some people say it's the constellation Draco or it's Polaris. It's like the center around which the stars spin. And that's the fixed point of space. That's why it's like a king on his throne. It's fixed. The wheel is always turning. That's the zodiac wheel, and it's also the wheel of time. So that's like the monarch who's revolving through the provinces, through the countryside. And the heart and the body, it says, is like a king in war, right? Meaning the heart is always grappling with this question of good and evil, right? So chapter 6 really returns to this question of the heart. And goes on to talk about the ways that the heart deals with Tov and Ra, with this idea of good and bad or good and evil. So the idea, like there's many organs are listed in Sefer Yetzirah as going with the different letters of the alphabet, but the heart is not one of those organs because the heart is considered to be the governing organ for the entire entity. And it's the heart, really, I think, that Sefer Yetzirah is trying to teach, right? Is trying to shape, right? How does a consciousness that is used to thinking of itself as a separate being connect to the larger unity of which it is a part? Right? That's really how I understand Sefer Yetzirah's issue. Right? Is how does this entity, right, that thinks of itself as a separate entity with an ego and a boundary, understand that in fact in one way that's not what I am at all, right? That I'm completely intertwined with larger entities of which I am a part. How do I understand that? Right? And Sefer Yetzirah is trying to offer practices that will help me, right, to get beyond that piece of myself, right? Help me get beyond the egoic nature of my existence. That's a way that I understand it.
And how do you feel? I mean, we've been talking about this like from a non-dual perspective. I know the teaching like in the Ve'ahavta, where it's like Levavecha, where it talks about two hearts. So like us sort of having one heart in the head and one in the core of the body. Can we reconcile these two ideas?
Say it again, please, Charlie.
So the bit of the Shema where
Mhm.
Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavecha b'chol nafshecha
Uh-huh.
u'b'chol me'odecha,
Mhm.
the teaching of with my heart, I've obviously heart is lev, but
Right.
there's two vavs that are put into that. And there's a teaching, and I'm sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head, about us having two hearts. Um, and I don't know how that sits with you in this perspective when we're working with the heart being a unifying sort of substance in the world.
Yeah, I mean, that teaching really is about the good and evil piece, right? Which Sefer Yetzirah also has, right? But, that the heart has two inclinations, right? It has a good inclination and a bad inclination. But for Sefer Yetzirah, both of those inclinations are absolutely necessary, right? For Sefer Yetzirah, all polarities are structural polarities, right? They're all meant to hold the structure of the universe, right? So just as north and south are meant to hold the structure of space, good and bad are meant to hold the structure of the human being, of the being, right? You can't get rid of one of them, right? So it's not a dualistic kind of view, right? It's actually it's a view in which both of those are necessary parts of the human experience. That's how I would say it.
That's actually very helpful. Thank you.
Great.
But I see Sean. Do you know whether there are any studies that compare or contrast the ways Sefer Yetzirah or Kabbalah more generally sacralizes all aspects of place and nature with the way Teilhard de Chardin attempts to do the same with an evolutionary mystical revision of Catholic theology?
I don't know of any studies like that. The closest thing I know of is the introduction to my book, where I talk about, I talk about the way that Sefer Yetzirah goes about this and mention some parallel sources in Gnosticism and Syriac Christianity. But I don't know of that particular comparison, and I think it would be really worthwhile for someone to do that. I think that would be pretty amazing. I'm sure there's lots of comparisons that could be made. But because I think the ecological aspect of this book was not as prominent for people, and that was part of why I wanted to write about it. I think there's still a lot of work yet to do.
Yeah, and Sean is also saying he mentioned your just ordered your book. So maybe this is a good plug, the Moonstone Covenant. It's out in if that's the book that maybe he's referencing, the
Oh, I
new one.
think he's talking about the Return to the Place, which is my book on
Got it.
safe. But by
Okay.
all means, order the novel too.
That too, that too.
Yes. In fact, the novel also has an ecological mysticism component. So if you're into that, it's called the Moonstone Covenant.
Oh, good evening.
Hi, David.
David Bamber at Watermark in Essex. Good evening to you all. I picked up this.
Go ahead, please.
He may have frozen. David, are you there? Okay, well, maybe we can circle back to you. David, feel free to jump in. So I see another question in the chat. Let's see, Sarah, are you asking a source that directly linked Teilhard or one that is similar to Teilhard's writings?
I was responding to Sean's question, so I'm not sure. I think that was answered already.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I want to mention one thing about the book Return to the Place, which is that in addition to translating and commenting on the text, I also created meditative practices for each of the paragraphs, because I really feel that it's a book that's meant to be a book of practice. So that's another thing about it.
So
Yeah, I see that Blake is asking a question too.
sure. Yeah, and I'll read it. I know in Eastern Christianity, there's the idea of God's energies that are present in the natural world. Are there similar ideas in Jewish mysticism? So I don't know if this relates to the elements that maybe we've been discussing or, yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's in Jewish mysticism, particularly in Kabbalah, there is a sense that divinity is present in everything, right, in every entity, and particularly in the elemental realm. And for example, when you look at early Hasidic masters and thinkers, many of them would go and pray outside. And the reason they would do that is that they felt that the energies that were in the plants and the animals would help them to pray. That God's, God's presence and the angels, the various angels that were governing the different plants and animals would be, would be present for them during their prayer. So I would say you can make such comparisons. Absolutely.
Would you mind, since this has come back about the elements, maybe speaking to, like in my first question, I was talking about the linear progression from like breath to air
Yes,
to
yes.
water to fire. In my head, I sort of went, well, what comes next? And that's why I thought of the angels in terms of like ongoing complexity as we're sort of building the fabric and the infrastructure of the natural world.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's why it's funny, I didn't think of the lulav, but that would be like the most obvious thing in terms of the hypercube. But I guess is that it feels like that's not a productive way to think of it.
Well, one of the ways that Sefer Yetzirah kind of breaks the mind, and I think in some ways, like a koan, it does mean to break the mind. It means for you to understand that the way that you think doesn't work, right? And one of the things that it does in order to do that is it offers dualities and then ruins them, then makes them not dualities. And it also offers progressions that turn out not to be progressions, right? It offers linear, like progressions like the elements that I read, but those elements also exist as um, a structure like this, right? That's nonlinear, right? That is more like a cube. And it also offers the structure of a wheel. And in terms of progression, let me just show you one thing, because this is really cool. So at the end of chapter 4, there is this amazing. Where are you? Here we are. Some of these passages move around, by the way. Different versions of Sefer Yetzirah look a little bit different. But in this passage, it talks about the combination of letters, essentially as a kind of DNA of the cosmos. And that the more letters you have and the more combinations you have, the more kinds of entities you have. And it's really this kind of exponential progression of creation based on an elemental model. And it uses the metaphor of stones and houses. So it says, in what way did God combine them? 2 stones built 2 houses. 3 build 6 houses. 4 build 24 houses. 5 build 120 houses. 6 build 720 houses. 7 build 5,040 houses. From here on out, go and contemplate what the mouth cannot say and the ear cannot hear. So this is essentially a progression from 1 to 2 to many, many, going out until infinity, which essentially begins to reapproach 1, right? So what you have is a kind of linear that turns into a sort of cyclical progression, right, from the 1 to the many. And house, by the way, is also the word for temple. So there's another reference to the temple here, but here the letters become stones, right? And the stones begin to combine to create many, many things. And you can see that this is, in a sense, it's almost like a tree of creation, right? That each combination of elemental forces gives rise to another unique manifestation, right? And God's world is enhanced the more different kinds of being there are, right? The more different kinds of creation there are. So this is a linear progression, but it's not really meant to be linear in the sense that eventually it says, eventually you're going to get to a point where you can no longer calculate this, right? You will no longer be able to calculate how much farther out the decimal point goes, right? You will get to a point where there's just an infinite mystery. And I think that's really the what Sefer Yetzirah wants us to do with our linear progressions, right? Is understand that all linear progressions lead to the infinite, and which essentially brings us back to 1.
I see a number of questions that have come in, and I'll rather than reading them, maybe I'll summarize. But There's a question about sort of like these participatory energies. If you can maybe speak to how that relates to our healing, maybe the healing of the human being or the more than human world. There's a question that's also come in about sort of the presence of God sitting in like the organic world, but maybe if you could speak to the inorganic world and artificial things like plastics and whether or not we can see divinity in those types of things. And then a question about gematria, if there's like a numerical relationship between the letters and some of these energies that we're talking about.
Yeah, Sefer Yetzirah is not using gematria. Gematria is a different tool for working with text, and Sefer Yetzirah is using something else. It's specifically thinking about combinations. You know, two things make two combinations, right? Three things make six combinations, right? And that's different than gematria. Gematria has to do with the numerical value of each letter. In terms of whether there are participatory energies that contribute to our healing, Kabbalah doesn't have a healing modality in the way that Eastern philosophies sometimes do, like Ayurveda, but it does have the concept of tikkun, which is essentially that everything that we do in the world has the possibility to contribute to healing, contribute to the healing of the world. And when we eat a fruit in a conscious way and we say a blessing, right, that raises up sparks that contributes to the reunification of the Godhead, right, and that's a kind of healing. So I'm not sure that that's the healing that you're talking about, but that's the kind of healing that Kabbalah tends to speak about, is the progression back toward unity. Right, everything has sparks that can be raised toward that goal of connecting back to ultimate unity. I'm not sure how a Kabbalistic worldview would relate to things like plastic. My sense is that Kabbalah tends to assume that everything is God, right? All matter is divinity. So I'm not sure that it would exclude things like plastic from that understanding. But I would like to think more about it. The Kabbalah does talk about things called klipot. Klipot means the shells, and essentially it refers to the containers that were made for the divine light. And they're often understood to be and then shattered, and the shards of those containers are often understood to be kind of toxic, like they need to be removed from reality. So I don't know, if you wanted to think that maybe plastic is related to the klipot, I guess you could. But I don't think a lot has been said about it, and might be interesting for someone to do some thinking about that.
Okay, well, Rabbi Hammer, on that note, I just want to thank you so much for your time. You're a wealth of knowledge and information, and thank you for the work that you do, that you continue to do. And I appreciate everyone's time here today. Yeah, so is there anything you'd like to say to close? I always like to give the last word.
Oh, just that I'm really grateful to have gotten to talk with all of you, and that I hope that this has been useful for people. I find it to be a really wonderful book as a companion for spiritual practice. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Charlie.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi Hammer. All the
Thank you.
best to you all wherever you are in the world, and until next time, thank you.